In Brazil, there is additional evidence that the man thought to be Josef Mengele was in fact the Nazi death camp doctor. 2 new witnesses have identified photographs of Mengele as the man they knew.
Brazil. A discreet exhumation awakens an old question. What if the corpse buried there was really that of the Auschwitz doctor? Nicknamed the Angel of Death, Josef Mengele starred in one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. After the fall of the Third Reich, he moved through Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay and Brazil, alternating moments of absolute clandestinity with periods of freedom, under the protection of former comrades, sympathizers and a surprising institutional tolerance. Over the years, West Germany disregarded reports that pointed directly to his whereabouts. Only one organization acted decisively, the Mossad. They had him close on more than one occasion, but they never managed to catch him. This documentary reconstructs his escape, but it also reveals a more disturbing background, how Mengele's cunning, combined with crossed interests and secret complicity, allowed him to die in freedom. The tattoo that saved Josef Mengele from the Allies. Josef Mengele's withdrawal began just 10 days before Soviet troops reached Auschwitz. His first destination was Gross Rosen, a camp located in Silesia, where he stayed briefly before being forced to flee again in the face of the unstoppable advance of the Red Army. Meanwhile, his mentor Ottmar von Verschuer accelerated the destruction of any evidence that linked him, sending 2 trucks full of files from the Research Institute in Berlin and eliminating the letters they exchanged. With the collapse of the front, Mengele joined a retreating Wehrmacht unit, replacing his SS uniform with one from the regular army, taking refuge with them in the central region of Czechoslovakia. Resistance was becoming increasingly unfeasible, and in early May, the Soviet advance reached Sars in the Sudets, where he found a motorized field hospital. There he recognized an old colleague, Hans Otto Kahler, who, although not a member of the Nazi Party, had worked under Verschuer's tutelage and became a key piece in protecting Mengele's identity. Mengele, doubtful in the face of news of Hitler's alleged suicide, requested to join the hospital, obtaining acceptance thanks to Kahler's intervention. On the night of the 8th of May, coinciding with the signing of the German surrender, the hospital crossed into Saxony, becoming trapped in a border area between Soviet and American forces, a territory with no clear control. Mengele, fearing being discovered as an SS member, adopted multiple identities in the daily records. Fritz Ullmann, doctor at the hospital, suspected his origin, but chose to remain silent. A little more than 1 month later, on the 15th of June, with the arrival of American troops, Josef managed to escape temporarily, joining an improvised column that managed to evade Allied checkpoints to cross into Bavaria. However, near Weiden, the lack of fuel stopped their advance, and he was captured. Although he was registered under his real name, Mengele retained a crucial advantage. He had never tattooed his blood group on his chest, as the SS required. This omission, the result of his vanity, was decisive in avoiding his final sentence. After his release from the prisoner camp, the Angel of Death could not imagine how much luck had favored him. Since April 1945, his name had been among the most wanted criminals by international organizations. Various survivors had already given statements to the Allied authorities, and the United Nations War Crimes Commission had included him on its list for mass murders and other atrocities. The Allied High Command in Paris had also registered him in the first central directory of war criminals and security suspects used in the detention camps. However, that information did not reach all the internment centers, or was not used effectively. The administrative chaos following the capitulation of the Third Reich, the pressure to quickly release millions of detainees, and the eagerness to rebuild the country created the ideal conditions for figures like Mengele to escape scrutiny. During his internment, the fear of being discovered caused him a state of anguish. Dr. Ullmann, neurologist and camp companion, was called by Kahler to treat his growing depression. It was then that Mengele confessed the reason for his anxiety. He feared that someone would identify his past in Auschwitz. Ullmann not only kept the secret, but also facilitated an escape route. Taking advantage of his position in the camp's administrative office, he obtained duplicates of release papers, one of which he gave to Mengele. When both were about to be released, a reorganization of the transports took Mengele to a second camp, where he again registered with his real name. More than 2 weeks passed until he was transferred to Ingolstadt. From there, he decided to head to Donauwörth, seeking refuge in the home of an old acquaintance, Albert Miller. On the way, a chance encounter with a farmer offered him an improvised means of transport, 2 bicycles. Mengele hid his real papers in the hollow handlebar of one of them and kept the false documents in his pocket. Upon reaching his destination, he said goodbye to the farmer, without realizing that the papers with his real name were going away with him. That carelessness forced him to permanently adopt the identity of Fritz Ullmann. When he arrived at the miller's house, he was received with distrust. To calm the suspicions, he tried to justify himself with an evasive phrase, that they should not believe everything that was said about him, but his presence did not go unnoticed. That same night, Albert Miller was arrested by American forces. Terrified at the possibility of being identified, Josef fled immediately. He crossed again into the Soviet zone with a single objective: to recover the scientific documents he had left in the custody of his former nurse. Upon his return from Soviet territory, where he had recovered his Auschwitz notes, Mengele found temporary refuge in Munich. There he was taken in by a friendly couple, whose connection with him dated back to the Eastern Front. For several weeks they helped him recover and discussed his legal situation with him. He remained convinced that he could appear before a court and prove his innocence. The couple, however, considered his view dangerously naive. They knew firsthand, through the chief pharmacist of Auschwitz, the full scale of the crimes committed. They warned him frankly that if he turned himself in, he would be executed. What most shattered the security of the Angel of Death was not rumors, but verified news. He learned that several Auschwitz doctors had already been sentenced. Fritz Klein, his colleague in the selections of newly arrived prisoners, had been hanged. Werner Roeder had also been sentenced, and Edward Wirths had committed suicide before standing trial. Even more significantly, in December 1946, the trial against 23 SS doctors began in Nuremberg. The charges ranged from experiments with sulfonamides to forced sterilizations, torture, and mass executions. Mengele followed the proceedings closely. He had conducted similar experiments on twins and with injections of diseases. He also shared the ideology of Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, who defended the use of humans as test subjects when animals were insufficient. The trial made it clear that such logic was no longer defensible. 7 of the defendants were sentenced to death and 5 to life imprisonment. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, the only woman among the accused, received 20 years for causing deaths with lethal injections. The impact of those sentences was profound. Josef understood that far from finding understanding, he would face the same fate if captured. In his autobiography, he wrote passages in which he justified the camp system and the internment of groups he considered dangerous because of their origin. He expressed without ambiguity his belief in the preventive detention of Jews, gypsies, and other supposed undesirable elements. Meanwhile, his closest circle reinforced his alibi. His father, detained in 1946 for his role in the local Nazi economic apparatus, repeatedly declared that Josef had disappeared in combat. His wife, Irene, for her part, maintained the deception even after knowing he was alive. Dressed in mourning, she asked for prayers for her deceased husband, thereby dispelling suspicions. Even when some witnesses, such as Dr. Gisela Perl, tried to alert the authorities about his whereabouts, bureaucratic confusion and administrative errors consolidated an alternative truth. For the official records, Josef Mengele had been dead since October 1946. Isolated, feared, and with no visible options, Mengele decided in the spring of 1949 to leave Germany forever. The decision did not arise from an organized network, as is sometimes assumed, but from a series of improvisations financed by his family and arranged through old SS contacts in the Günzburg region. The initial plan contemplated a safe passage to Italy, but when obtaining a convincing passport on the black market failed, he had to cross the Alps clandestinely. From Innsbruck he reached Steinach, at the foot of the Brenner Pass, where the first of several intermediaries, whose identity he coded in his memoirs, was waiting for him. At dawn on the 18th of April, guided by a local contact, he crossed the border on foot under the full moon, avoiding border controls thanks to the darkness and the routine of alpine smuggling. Once on Italian soil, he took the first train to Vipiteno. A mistake made him get off too early, and he only boarded the correct train after blending in with a group of passengers. His destination was the Golden Cross hostel, where he was already registered under a false name, Fritz Hollmann. There he was received by a second collaborator, probably Hans Sedelmeier, a trusted employee of the family business. The latter gave him cash, and according to Mengele himself, a small suitcase containing biological samples he had kept since Auschwitz. Over the following weeks, he carefully reviewed the itinerary he had to follow. From Vipiteno, he traveled to Bozen and met with Kurt, who was in charge of the final leg. The latter arranged the false documentation, including a Red Cross passport issued in Switzerland under the identity of Helmut Gregor. They then went to the Argentine consulate, where the visa was processed without major difficulties. But when seeking formal exit from Italy, the official who normally handled these cases was on vacation. For this reason, Kurt suggested trying to bribe the substitute. Josef did so, but the gesture gave him away. He was detained, interrogated, and locked up for 3 weeks in conditions he himself described with contempt. His luck seemed exhausted until the regular official returned and cleared the pending paperwork. With the exit visa finally in order, Josef Mengele boarded the North King bound for Buenos Aires on the 25th of May, 1949. Buenos Aires, the modern refuge for Third Reich criminals. After several weeks of uncertainty, the Angel of Death finally arrived in Argentina on the 22nd of June, 1949. The landing marked the beginning of a phase filled with unforeseen tensions. Although he had trusted that a local contact would be waiting for him at the dock, he found no one. To this was added a setback at customs. One of the agents, intrigued by the contents of his suitcase, asked to examine it. Upon answering that it contained biological notes, the presence of a port doctor was required. Not understanding the documents in German, the official reviewed them superficially and let him pass. Without local money or accommodation, he depended on 2 Italian traveling companions who took him to a low-category boarding house in the Palermo neighborhood, where he shared a room without any comforts. From that modest starting point, he began looking for work. With an address provided by his contacts in Europe, he went to the office of a textile entrepreneur, whom his diary mentions only as shot. Although he expected a position of responsibility, he was offered only manual labor in the factory, which Mengele considered unworthy of his education and experience. At that moment, his situation bordered on destitution. He no longer had the direct protection of his family, and the fall from absolute power in Auschwitz to urban misery in Buenos Aires was harder than he had expected. Finally, he accepted work as a carpenter, attracted by the possibility of having a room in the Vicente Lopez neighborhood. Although he had hardly any privacy, since he shared the space with an engineer, it was the first relatively stable base he managed to establish. Living together put him in an uncomfortable position. His roommate, noticing medical instruments among his belongings, grew suspicious of his past. Josef denied being a doctor, but when the engineer's daughter fell ill, he agreed to treat her. He isolated the girl, brought her fever down with cold compresses, and prescribed a combination of sulfonamides and chamomile tea. Afterwards, he made the father swear to keep the secret. During those first months, he began writing a diary that reflected his disorientation and anxiety as a fugitive. However, that record stops abruptly and does not reappear until 1960. At the same time, correspondence with his family has been preserved, in which he described his adaptation to a vibrant and modern city. Buenos Aires offered an advanced environment, with German-language newspapers, an exuberant theater scene, and an active intellectual life that surprised him with its level, even in comparison with Europe. In his attempt to stabilize his new life in the Argentine capital, Mengele observed with interest the contrasts that surrounded him. Despite his fugitive status, the urban environment of Buenos Aires felt familiar to him. Tree-lined avenues, ornate squares, slate roofs, and outdoor cafes that reminded him of Paris. The European architecture, bourgeois refinement, and apparent devotion to social hierarchies reinforced his sense of belonging. But behind that cosmopolitan facade lay a deeply unequal country, where shanty towns grew in the shadows of palaces, and where a cattle-owning oligarchy dominated the economy with power inherited across generations. The political and religious climate also favored his anonymity. Argentina was largely Catholic, with an influential conservative church that was openly intolerant toward minorities such as the Jewish community, which still had no access to ministerial positions. This atmosphere of exclusion fitted perfectly with the ideas Mengele had defended for years. In addition, the country had a large German colony, consolidated long before the war, with schools in their language, neighborhoods of strong national identity, and social networks that made it easy for newcomers like him to integrate. Some local newspapers had even adopted an editorial line favorable to the Nazi regime since the 1930s, and during the war, support for the Third Reich among Germans in Argentina was so widespread that it prompted an official investigation. Although that commission concluded that thousands of immigrants were linked to Hitler's government and received funds from Germany to promote a Fourth Reich in the Southern Hemisphere, Juan Domingo Perón's government decided not to intervene. Instead, it facilitated their settlement. Perón, a military man who admired the Italian fascist model, had come to power in 1943 after a coup d'etat, and his policy was openly favorable to Nazi fugitives. He reserved thousands of blank passports to facilitate their entry, activated diplomatic contacts in Europe, and trusted that a future defeated Germany would rebuild itself under principles similar to those of the Third Reich. Under his administration, Argentina became one of the main destinations for German war criminals. Perón himself, together with Eva Duarte, had protected and channeled funds coming from Nazi looting. Part of the gold, precious stones, and works of art that arrived from Europe was stored in Argentine banks under false identities controlled by their trusted circles. In that context, Mengele went from living in precarious conditions to settling in the residence of a supposed Nazi sympathizer in the exclusive Florida area, without the immigration authorities asking uncomfortable questions about his origin or his documents. Now settled in an environment that offered him political protection, ideological affinity, and institutional tolerance, Mengele began to weave new personal relationships that would ensure his survival in exile. Little by little, he integrated into a network made up of former Third Reich officials and influential figures of Argentine nationalism. Among the first to approach him was Wilhelm Sassen, a former Abwehr agent experienced in disinformation operations, who would become a key figure in the circle of Nazi refugees in South America. Sassen, a Dutchman by birth and a member of the SS, had arrived in Argentina in 1948, thanks to the still active German intelligence connections in the country. In his own words, he described Dr. Josef as a brilliant, cultured and good doctor, downplaying the credibility of the accusations about his crimes in Auschwitz, which he attributed to rumors impossible to refute without conclusive proof. In 1952, it was Sassen who introduced Josef to another fugitive, Adolf Eichmann, who at that time was living in the Argentine capital under the name Ricardo Clement. Although they shared a past and a fate, they never forged a close friendship. Mengele despised Eichmann's defeated attitude and considered him a broken figure. Moreover, unlike himself, the organizer of the final solution lacked his own resources and depended entirely on clandestine networks. The Angel of Death, on the other hand, enjoyed economic backing and an environment willing to protect him. One of his closest allies during those years was the architect Federico Haase, a well-connected figure in Paraguayan political circles. Haase introduced him to contacts who would later facilitate his naturalization in Paraguay, and also presented him to Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a former Luftwaffe pilot and German war hero. Rudel, known for his egomania and his role in support networks for fugitives such as Kameradenwerk, offered both influence and experience. In the mid-1950s, Mengele began traveling frequently to Paraguay, initially as a commercial representative of his family's agricultural company. These trips were made with such freedom that, according to coinciding reports from the time, he never hid his identity nor used false names when crossing the borders between Argentina, Paraguay and Brazil. Although his family, particularly his nephew Dieter Mengele, has denied any financial relationship with him, various testimonies and intelligence reports indicate that the economic support came, at least in part, from the company founded by his father in Günzburg. During that same period, European authorities redoubled their efforts to capture him. In June 1959, Judge Robert Müller of the Freiburg court issued an international arrest warrant for multiple premeditated murders. The process began thanks to the survivor Hermann Langbein, who requested that extradition be handled discreetly. That confidentiality, however, was broken. A leak in the Günzburg police allowed the Mengele family to warn him before the official notification arrived. By then, he had already applied for Paraguayan citizenship using his real name. He had the support of Alejandro von Eckstein, a figure in the Stroessner regime, and of Werner Jung, a former Nazi comrade. When questioned, Jung merely said, "Mengele asked me if I wanted to be a witness, and I said yes." Thanks to the intervention of Minister Edgar Insfran, in October he received his Paraguayan identity card and, shortly afterward, an official certificate of good conduct. Judge Luis Martinez Miltos validated the naturalization with that document, together with the sworn statements of his sponsors. There was no extradition treaty with West Germany, and Stroessner was not willing to hand over someone the state had legally welcomed. Moreover, citizenship allowed him to buy land, which he was already arranging in Alto Paraná, across from Misiones. Coinciding with the closing of the file, Mengele was informed of his father's death. Although he wished to return for the funeral, he gave up when he learned that the Bavarian police would try to capture him. Consequently, he sent a wreath with a ribbon that read, "Greetings from afar." Shortly afterward, the German consulate in Asunción officially confirmed his presence, but the Paraguayan authorities, alerted in advance, carefully emptied the file before Consul Engermann could review it. At the same time, Interpol requested the file from its headquarters in Paris, although its intervention did not pose a concrete threat. The organization still considered Nazi crimes to be political matters outside its competence. In that climate of complacency, on the 27th of November, the official citizenship document was issued without obstacles in the name of Josef Mengele. While his new legal identity was consolidated in Paraguay, on the other side of the Atlantic, the diplomatic route was showing its limits. West Germany had begun formal procedures, but with scant expectations. From Israel, skepticism was growing. Argentina had already stated that it would not cooperate, considering the charges to be of a political nature. This stance, common in the region, confirmed to Israel that legal mechanisms would not work. In that context, another strategy began to take shape, an active notion of international justice. Soon afterward, that change would make another fugitive a priority, Adolf Eichmann. The Mossad's double hunt in Buenos Aires. The Israeli strategy to capture Adolf Eichmann was, from the very beginning, a break with the Mossad's traditional methods. Until then, its priorities had focused on external threats, especially those coming from Moscow. However, after receiving concrete information about Eichmann's whereabouts in Argentina, the agency's director, Isser Harel, shifted his focus. In a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1957, he was given a piece of information that convinced him Eichmann was living in Buenos Aires under a false name. In the following weeks, Harel thoroughly reviewed the file of the former SS bureaucrat and decided to act, even without formal support from the German government. For him, the trial was not only a matter of justice, but a national responsibility. In Harel's own words, Israel was the only country willing to judge him in accordance with the law and historical memory. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion approved the mission without hesitation. It was then that an unexpected possibility arose. Josef Mengele, also in Argentina, was living under his real name. Although the information available about him was more fragmentary, it was known that he maintained commercial activity, that his wife appeared in the telephone directory, and that he moved with relative freedom between Buenos Aires and Paraguay. Harel considered that, if the operation against Eichmann was successful, attempting to capture Josef would be a logical next step. As he noted in his diary, "If we have already invested so much, we should try to bring Mengele as well." However, the initial surveillance failed due to an error of judgment. A key informant, Lothar Hermann, had correctly indicated Eichmann's address, but he was dismissed after a confusion regarding the identity of the house owner. This caused a delay of 18 months, during which time Mengele once again crossed the border into Argentina to see his family. He did so coinciding with the relaunch of the Mossad operation in April 1960. In those days, Harel decided to personally take charge of the operation and compiled in code all the relevant data about Mengele. He knew that if discovered by the Argentine authorities, justifying one covert action would already be difficult, but justifying two was simply impossible. The opportunity to also capture the Angel of Death during the operation against Adolf Eichmann became more concrete when, during the interrogations in his improvised cell, Eichmann mentioned a boarding house where, as he recalled, Mengele had resided. The place was run by a German woman named Jürmann, and although Issa Harel already knew that address, he was surprised that Eichmann confirmed his connection to it. It was an isolated house, surrounded by a white fence, on a quiet street in the greater Buenos Aires area. The news created tension within the team. Zvi Aharoni, who had been key in tracking Eichmann, expressed his reservations. For him and other members of the mission, attempting a second operation endangered the main objective. Eichmann's extraction had not yet been completed, and any additional movement could compromise everything. Aharoni would later acknowledge that he did not even know who Mengele was at that moment, and that his only priority was to return with the prisoner to Israel without incidents. Despite the warnings, Harel did not abandon the idea. He lacked sufficient personnel, but managed to convince two agents to help him: Menashe, who could collaborate partially, and Shalom Dani, who volunteered. They needed more, especially people who spoke Spanish fluently. At that point, he turned to Meir Lavi, who had collaborated on the night of the kidnapping, and who, together with his wife, lived in Argentina. However, his command of the language was not sufficient to infiltrate as a guest in the boarding house. It was then that he met Binyamin and Ada Efrat, an Israeli couple living in Buenos Aires. Harel was impressed. Binyamin spoke like a local and was willing to take on any task related to Mengele. In the following days, they watched the boarding house, posed as neighbors, and simulated casual visits. They used cameras hidden in briefcases to photograph those who entered and left, but the faces captured were only of children. In an attempt to obtain more information, Binyamin asked the postman about a supposed Dr. Mengele, claiming that he was his uncle and that he must live nearby. The postman replied that someone with that name had been in that house, but had left weeks earlier. Neither he nor the post office knew his new address. All letters were returned to the sender. Unwilling to give up, Harel followed another lead: a small workshop where Josef manufactured parts for textile machinery and children's toys. Under the name Gregor, he had maintained some business activity there. Binyamin went to the place pretending to need special screws, but was turned away after a short wait. No one, according to the secretary, knew any Gregor or carried out that type of work. The lead about the workshop where Josef had supposedly worked under the alias Gregor vanished quickly. Although the secretary's evasive behavior suggested she knew that name, Harel soon realized that the fugitive's connections to that place had ended years earlier. Without agents trained to infiltrate effectively and with the main team focused on Eichmann, the Mossad director admitted that he could not continue down that path. The operational margin was minimal, and the priority remained the safe extraction of the prisoner already captured. Nevertheless, Harel still contemplated one final maneuver: capturing Mengele just a few hours before the takeoff of the El Al plane that would repatriate Eichmann. To that end, he urgently requested Tel Aviv to send a trained commando group in order to raid the boarding house if it was confirmed that Mengele was still there. The plan was to approach all the residents, verify their identities, and, if they found the former Auschwitz doctor, put him on the plane moments before takeoff. As a preliminary measure, he sent 2 agents to the boarding house in Vicente Lopez for a final check. Binyamin Efrat, pretending to be a boiler technician, managed to enter. He confirmed what the neighbors had already indicated. The current tenants were American citizens, and there was no trace of the suspect. At the same time, Maya Lavi, who was supposed to pose as a delivery man, ended up opting for a telephone call to the administrator, questioning her about former guests. Harel was annoyed by this slip, since such imprudence, had Mengele been there, could have sent him fleeing. Although the chances were minimal, Harel acknowledged that the feeling of having been so close to capturing him was hard to accept. According to his calculations, Josef had left the boarding house only weeks earlier. Although since May 1959 he had resided mainly in Paraguay, it was known that he visited Buenos Aires with some frequency to see his family, and everything indicated that this had been one of those visits. While the simultaneous search was dissolving, the team fulfilled its main objective. On the night of the 20th of May, the Israeli agents managed to discreetly board a sedated Eichmann at Ezeiza airport, passing him off as a sick crew member of the flight. Later, reports emerged suggesting that the Argentine secret services had closely followed every phase of the operation. According to documents attributed to Side, the Frondizi government would have ordered them not to intervene, limiting themselves to observing. Although there were indications pointing to possible passive complicity on the part of the Frondizi government, the truth is that, barely a few weeks after Eichmann's kidnapping, Argentina pushed for a formal condemnation against Israel before the United Nations Security Council. On the 5th of June of 1960, the resolution was approved unanimously. Israel had violated Argentine sovereignty by taking Eichmann through clandestine methods. Even countries traditionally close to the Jewish state joined the rebuke. The possibility that an Argentine president would prioritize Israeli interests over those of his own country was, at least publicly, unacceptable. The most plausible explanation is that the Argentine intelligence services, overwhelmed by events, tried to save face by drafting false reports after the operation. The incident unleashed a wave of anti-Semitic reactions that spread rapidly across South America. Jewish cemeteries were vandalized, schools set on fire, restaurants attacked with firearms, and several synagogues were targeted with explosives. In Colombia, Nazi sympathizers organized events in memory of the criminals executed in Nuremberg, while far-right youth groups held demonstrations in various capitals of the region. The atmosphere became even darker when cases of direct violence began to circulate. In Montevideo, the Israeli ambassador's residence was bombed, and in Buenos Aires, Graciela Sirota, daughter of the owner of one of the houses used by the Mossad, was kidnapped, abused and tortured with Nazi symbols carved into her body. Another shocking case was that of Mirta Penjarek, a young woman murdered after being linked to the logistics of Eichmann's captivity. Faced with that adverse scenario, Harel chose to act. In Tel Aviv, he formed a special unit with a clear objective: to capture the Angel of Death. The operations center was located in Paris and placed under the direction of Zvi Aharoni. From 1961 onwards, several team members were deployed in Europe and Latin America. In the European continent, they tried to approach Mengele's family circle and follow the steps of Hans Rudel, one of his former protectors. In South America, the mission was to infiltrate the networks that still sheltered fugitive Nazis. Harel stated that this new operation required even more resources than the previous one, but political pressure and internal criticism would soon take their toll. From Paraguay to Brazil, the final route of the Angel of Death. Just as the Mossad operation began to fade in the shadows of Vicente Lopez, more than 8,000 kilometers away, a Jewish businessman living on the west coast of the United States opened his newspaper in astonishment. There, printed in black and white, he recognized the image of the man with whom, years earlier in Buenos Aires, he had almost gone into partnership in the textile business. In disbelief, he immediately telephoned the woman who had introduced them. Both confirmed the unthinkable. That acquaintance was Josef Mengele. In Paraguay, the fugitive was going through a critical stage. Hidden on a rural property belonging to a German businessman named Alban Krug in the south of the country, the news of Eichmann's capture, the arrest warrant issued by Argentina, and above all the sudden death of his close collaborator Federico Haase, plunged Josef into a deep emotional crisis. In his diary, he intensely mourned the loss of the person he considered his greatest support in uncertain times. The architect's death was not only a personal blow, but also the collapse of his protection network in Paraguay. Isolated and paranoid, he began to seriously consider the idea of suicide. A few days later, a visitor known as Don C. landed on a private airstrip near the farm, bringing German publications with him. In them, for the first time, detailed descriptions of the crimes committed in Auschwitz appeared. Mengele read them carefully, feeling besieged by what he described as a defamation campaign, driven by the ancestral hatred of the Old Testament. In his distorted perception, everything was part of a global revenge against the heroic memory of the Reich. In parallel, the Federal Republic of Germany once again pushed for an extradition request to Argentina, despite the absence of a bilateral treaty. The case fell to Judge Jorge Luque, who saw in it a way to restore his country's international image after the Eichmann scandal. Although West Germany offered a public reward for a Nazi criminal for the first time, no informant came forward. By then, Mengele had already vanished. Judge Jorge Luque's efforts to locate Josef Mengele began to encounter extraordinary obstacles from the very beginning. Even without Argentine citizenship, and after having lied in his entry declaration to the country in 1949, bureaucracy demanded that the entire extradition file comply with the Argentine Penal Code. As if that were not enough, the first documents sent from Germany arrived written in German, when the required legal language was Spanish, which forced the process to be restarted. But the most revealing aspect was the scant precision of the information forwarded by the German embassy regarding the addresses where the Nazi doctor had supposedly resided. Some addresses lacked a town or city, and others turned out to be completely wrong. For example, number 968 on Vertis Street never existed. After a fruitless search, the agents finally identified a plausible variant, Viri Vertis 970 in the suburb of Olivos, where former neighbors claimed to have seen him months earlier, but with no current traces. The judge suspected that the police authorities were hiding something. He never managed to prove it, but he did not rule out the possibility that there had been bribes financed by the Mengele family. Another police team investigated a boarding house located at 500 July Street, number 1074, in Vicente Lopez. There, the owner, Bergilda Jurman, was questioned. She admitted knowing Martha, Josef's wife, and her stepson, whom she identified as Carlos Enrique, although she denied ever having had contact with the fugitive. The information was the same that the Israeli agents had handled months earlier, without results. Faced with the lack of progress, Luque requested a nationwide search, but it was initially rejected by the head of the federal police, Admiral Niceto Vega, who argued that he was not going to mobilize resources to locate a foreigner who had committed no crimes in Argentina. Only weeks later was a telegram sent with the arrest warrant, detailing the identity and the suspected addresses. However, the information arrived too late. Mengele was no longer in the country. Informed of the administrative chaos by Martha and her stepson, who still visited him sporadically at the Krug farm in Paraguay, Mengele did not feel threatened by the Argentines or the Germans, but by the Israelis. Fearing capture, he decided to leave Paraguay for good. In October 1960, he crossed the border toward Brazil, accompanied until the last moment by Hans Rudel and Alban Krug, the latter bidding him farewell with a warning that his war was not yet over. There, in a city he described as having constant traffic, hills, and urban noise, his next stage began with the decisive help of Wolfgang Gerhard, a fervent Nazi who provided him with contacts, shelter, and new documents. After arriving in Brazil, the Auschwitz doctor discreetly integrated into Gerhard's circle and his contacts. There, exile offered more than mere protection, an environment where his ideology was not questioned, but shared. The exaltation of Nazism persisted in everyday gestures, family rituals, and a rhetoric of hatred that found an echo among those around him. In that atmosphere, where his past provoked not rejection but understanding, Mengele found something akin to validation. For a man who was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounding himself with people who not only protected him, but reaffirmed his worldview, was as valuable as any forged document. Gerhard's usefulness to Josef was not limited to fanaticism. With contacts in the real estate sector and knowledge of the Brazilian interior, he offered escape routes and remote stays, ideal for a fugitive like him. In one of these properties, located in Itapecerica, about 70 kilometers from Sao Paulo, Mengele stayed for several months. There, Gerhard introduced him to his future protectors, Géza and Gitta Stammer, a Hungarian couple who had been in exile since 1948. Although they claimed not to sympathize with Nazism, they shared certain revisionist views about the Holocaust, which made them willing to take in a stranger as Peter Hochbichler, supposedly a Swiss man interested in rural life. The proposal seemed advantageous. The Stammers needed a manager for a 37-acre farm in Nova Europa, a settlement of German colonists northwest of Sao Paulo. Peter presented himself as an experienced cattle rancher eager to invest in Brazil. Although he refused any salary, claiming he only wanted peace and quiet, his behavior soon drew the attention of the workers. He was bossy, short-tempered, and not very skilled at farm work, though he showed some veterinary skill by successfully operating on a calf with a hernia. The general impression, however, was that of a reserved man out of touch with rural reality, more interested in reading philosophy than in running a plantation. That contrast did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Stammer said she felt uncomfortable with his authoritarian attitude, and at the same time the employees began to notice unusual details. He always wore a hat, even in the sun, and avoided appearing bareheaded. His formal clothing, inappropriate for the rural setting, reinforced the feeling that the man was hiding something. That caution was well-founded. From Paris, Zvi Aharoni was directing a new Mossad unit focused exclusively on his capture. Although his exact whereabouts remained a mystery, the Israeli network had begun to reconstruct the map of his movements, patiently and discreetly tightening the net. Zvi Aharoni from Paris acknowledged the frustration. After several trips to Paraguay in 1961, they failed to obtain any solid lead. Some agents adopted undercover identities as historians or financial advisors, but they did not even manage to establish direct links with people close to Mengele. The hypothesis that he was hiding between Paraguay and Brazil seemed solid, but the lack of concrete evidence prevented any direct action. Despite the investment of resources and the growing scale of the operation, the Mossad was unable to confirm his whereabouts with the certainty required for a kidnapping. At the same time, West Germany continued to maintain its own investigation. In February 1961, Fritz Bauer extended the extradition request to Brazil based on unverified rumors that Mengele had fled there. The diplomat Peter Bench from Asunción gathered documents and tried to question possible witnesses, but the Paraguayan authorities blocked the process, arguing that they had no obligation to cooperate if the accused was a citizen of the country. Due to the tense atmosphere that prevailed in Nova Europa and certain suspicions that were beginning to arise, Josef Mengele agreed to move with the Stammers to a farm in Serra Negra, a mountainous area north of Sao Paulo. Although he was initially reluctant, he soon began to feel comfortable. He helped with carpentry tasks and spoke of the place as a spiritual refuge. But that apparent balance did not last long. Gitta Stammer noticed his mood swings. He would go from affability to withdrawal, and his treatment of the workers was humiliating and aggressive. Doubts grew. Despite claiming to come from a peasant family, his way of speaking, his interest in literature, and his paranoid attitude toward visitors contradicted his story. Until one day, among the pages of a forgotten newspaper, Gitta found a photograph. It was a young Nazi officer with an unmistakable smile. She confronted him, and although he remained silent at first, that same night he admitted his true identity. The impact was immediate. Géza Stammer traveled to Sao Paulo and contacted Wolfgang Gerhard, who promised to arrange his transfer. Shortly afterward, Hans Sedlmayr arrived from Germany, sent by the Mengele family. He brought money and promises, but no solution. The tension only increased. Mengele began to blame his hosts for his situation, and his attitude became increasingly hostile. In a moment of desperation, the Stammers considered reporting him, but Gerhard dissuaded them with a barely veiled warning. The end of the executioner. Mengele dies in freedom. When cohabitation with the Stammers finally broke down, Josef entered a stage marked by emotional isolation and a growing dependence on family correspondence. Although he still received occasional help from Hans Sedelmeier and the young Karl-Heinz, it was his son Rolf who occupied an increasingly prominent place in his thoughts. The fugitive maintained an intense epistolary relationship with him, not only as a form of deferred affection, but as a means to influence his perception. In his letters, veiled reproaches abounded, appeals to filial duty and bitter reflections on his situation. He claimed his innocence in a didactic tone, trying to delegitimize any ethical or historical judgment about his past, while lamenting the lack of financial commitment on the part of his son. Despite his initial enthusiasm at the idea of a reunion, Mengele sensed that Rolf was not seeking reconciliation, but answers. This suspicion led him to adopt a defensive and rhetorical stance, insisting that any conversation had to avoid simplistic judgments or pre-established moral positions. In his view, the dialogue had to be between equals, free from what he called cheap resentments or emotional simplifications. As the exchanges progressed, it became evident that his openness was only apparent. He rejected any deep questioning about his role in Auschwitz and took refuge in attacks on the press, communism, and historical ignorance. The epistolary tension was aggravated by the constant parallels he drew between Rolf and Karl-Heinz. He elevated the latter as an example of maturity, effort, and loyalty, while belittling the former's life decisions, from abandoning his doctorate to the failure of his marriage. He even criticized his son's lifestyle, accusing him of aspiring to a false modesty incompatible with family dignity. Each letter revealed a persistent attempt to shape Rolf's identity from afar, turning the relationship into a monologue loaded with guilt and frustration. On the other hand, the relationship with the Stammers finally collapsed. Gesa Stammer left the farm, and not even Sedelmeier's arrival with money managed to reverse the definitive rupture. Having overcome the collapse with the Stammers and enveloped in growing solitude, the Nazi doctor channeled his energies toward an increasingly obsessive goal: orchestrating a secret visit from his son Rolf. Since 1973, he had drawn up a meticulous, almost military plan, with instructions detailing every step of the journey. He recommended using a false passport, avoiding predictable patterns, moving between metro stations and hotels without raising suspicions, and aborting the mission at any sign of surveillance. For Mengele, there was no room for error. The slightest slip could cost him his freedom. Rolf, for his part, took 4 years to accept the proposal. He was not driven by affection or nostalgia, but by the need to confront directly the man behind decades of epistolary justifications. He was tired of the exchanges by letter and of his father's condescending tone, which never acknowledged guilt or accepted judgments about his past. Even so, the trip awakened contradictory emotions, between family duty and moral repulsion, between the need for answers and the fear of confirming what he already suspected. During that time, Hans Sedelmeier, the family's usual intermediary, was forced to shoulder the logistical burden of the operation. He arranged prior meetings with Karl-Heinz to coordinate the money delivery, reviewed possible itineraries from Luxembourg to Sao Paulo, and tried to calm Mengele's anxiety, since the fugitive could not tolerate any changes to the original plan. The letters from the escapee dripped with impatience and control. He demanded to know every detail of the false passport, opposed his son driving without proper documentation, and was scandalized at the idea that Rolf might act like a tourist without following strict instructions. At the same time, Sedelmeier warned Josef about the generational abyss that separated him from his son. He reminded him that the world had changed and that he could not judge from afar a reality he no longer understood. But the tensions soon worsened. Tired of the demands, Sedelmeier asked to be relieved of his role as mediator. In the end, however, he gave in once again to prevent the meeting from falling through. Finally, the trip was set for October 1977, with an additional visit from Hans Rudel on the horizon, although the encounter between father and son was still far from what either of them expected. Once the definitive travel date was set, Rolf left Frankfurt for Rio de Janeiro aboard a Varig charter flight. He carried a passport stolen months earlier from an acquaintance during a vacation. The resemblance between them seemed sufficient to him to bypass immigration controls, and the document, according to his father, had to be foolproof. Along with the passport, he brought gifts for the Bossats, cash, a Latin dictionary, and several personal errands from his father. He was accompanied by a close friend whose identity he never revealed, who was responsible for carrying Rolf's real passport in case complications arose. While Rolf carried out the visit in Sao Paulo, his companion would enjoy a few days at the beach, and both would return together on the flight back. Rolf spent the first night in a luxury hotel in Rio, registered under the borrowed identity, and the next day took a domestic flight to Sao Paulo. To make sure he was not being followed, he took several taxis and avoided direct routes before arriving at the Bossett's home. The final stretch was completed in a battered van, traveling along dirt roads to a modest neighborhood where his father's house awaited him. The reunion, after more than 2 decades, did not take place in an imposing setting, but in a humble dwelling with brick floors and sparse furniture. Mengele, aged, visibly anxious and moved, greeted his son with an awkward hug and tears in his eyes. The first exchanges were cautious. Rolf chose to adopt a moderate tone, listening to his father's arguments without confronting him openly, intending to lower his guard. Little by little, he began to ask pointed questions about his time at Auschwitz, avoiding direct judgments and looking for inconsistencies. Josef responded with philosophical digressions, pseudo-scientific references, and long justifications about the selection of prisoners, equating his work to that of a war doctor forced to decide whom to treat first. He rejected any responsibility for the deaths and insisted that his intervention, according to him, had saved lives. During the 2 weeks they lived together, Rolf confirmed that his father retained intellectual lucidity, but also a total disconnection from the most basic principles of humanity. Despite his efforts, he failed to obtain a single admission of guilt. In the end, he understood that no moral reconciliation would be possible. Mengele did not understand, or did not want to understand, that his mere presence in that place made him part of the horror. Despite the tension built up during the conversations, Rolf spent most of his days in the company of the Bossetts, a couple who had earned his father's trust and who, unlike the Stammers, treated him with a mixture of respect, affection, and nostalgia. From the very first moment, the Bossetts tried to make his visit as pleasant as possible, although they soon noticed a certain emotional distance between father and son. Lieselot, the wife, summed it up frankly. There did not seem to be a real connection between them, but there was a form of silent respect, perhaps marked by the generational conflict and the moral abyss that separated them. Rolf, on the other hand, closely observed the kind of bonds his father had established with the 2 families who had sheltered him in Brazil. While the Stammers had ended up feeling harassed by his authoritarian attitude and inflexible character, the Bossetts found in him a brilliant interlocutor capable of offering answers to their concerns about the past. Moreover, they valued that, despite his eccentricities and bouts of bad temper, he needed their help and devotion, something they were willing to offer without expecting anything in return. When his presence bothered them, they simply walked away or let him know without hard feelings. During those days, Rolf accompanied his father to places of personal significance. Together, they visited previous properties in Serra Negra and Caieiras, where they were warmly received. They also traveled to Bertioga, a beach east of Sao Paulo, unaware that it would be there where his life would end 16 months later. In a local jewelry shop, Mengele bought an emerald ring for Almuth, Rolf's fiancée, as a gesture of reconciliation or perhaps an early farewell. As the visit drew to a close, the atmosphere between them seemed less tense, although Rolf was aware that their differences would remain unresolved. On the day of departure, the reunion ended with a brief and restrained goodbye at Sao Paulo airport. Josef, paranoid about the possibility of being watched, barely managed a sentence before walking away. Rolf knew he would never see him again. Rolf's return to Germany marked the end of any hope for a lasting reconciliation between father and son. Despite the emotional restraint shown during the visit, Josef Mengele was deeply affected by the departure. In the following weeks, he tried to maintain the bond through letters, thanking him for the days they had shared, and regretting how brief the encounter had been. In his words, one could sense a mixture of restrained pride and bitter resignation. He acknowledged that his son had not succumbed to his influence, yet he celebrated at least having been visited by someone of his own blood. At the same time, his physical and psychological decline became ever more evident. He refused to move to more pleasant areas, fearing that any new contact might pose a threat. His isolation was now absolute, yet he longed for company. Physically, the situation was increasingly alarming. Hypertension, infections, chronic back pain, and prostate problems were pushing him to the limit. The few people who still dealt with him began to avoid him, tired of his complaints. Even those closest to him, such as Wolfram Bossert, treated him with indifference. For Mengele, this felt almost like betrayal. In a letter to Sedlmayr, he lamented that he had not even been informed of the birth of his grandson, and the lack of news from Rolf plunged him into silent sadness. It was then that he accepted an invitation from the Bosserts to spend a few days at the beach. As he himself said before leaving, "I'm going because my life is already over." On the afternoon of the 7th of February 1979, the Nazi doctor finally agreed to go out. The sun was still beating down hard when he decided to enter the sea, perhaps seeking some relief. At first, nothing suggested danger, but just a few minutes later he began to thrash about, caught in a current that was rapidly growing stronger. Andreas Bossert was the first to realize something was wrong and alerted his father, who reacted immediately. Wolfram Bossert threw himself into the water without hesitation. He reached Mengele when the man could barely move, paralyzed by a second stroke. With enormous effort, he swam with one hand while holding the body with the other, unable to feel the bottom beneath his feet. For a moment, Mengele seemed to regain consciousness and tried to swim on his own, but that fleeting will vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His arm fell limp, his face lost all expression, and there was no further reaction. With great difficulty, Bossert managed to use the push of the waves to get closer to the shore. A group of people waded into the water to help pull the body out. Mengele was laid on the sand while a doctor who was present tried to resuscitate him. For a few brief seconds, there seemed to be a faint response, but the attempts proved futile. As the hours passed and the tide rose, the body had to be moved several times to prevent the water from covering it. The scene, growing ever more absurd and desolate, culminated with the arrival of Officer Expedicio Diaz Romao. It was already night when he appeared. In front of the corpse, Lieselotte Bossert crouched beside the head, holding a lit candle and repeating in a broken voice, "The uncle has died." Josef Mengele died without ever having been captured, tried, or even identified with certainty for decades. His impunity was not accidental. It resulted from the ineffectiveness of international legal mechanisms, the disinterest of certain governments, and protection networks that sheltered him without consequences. West Germany did not manage to issue an effective arrest warrant until well into the post-war period, nor did the Mossad prioritize his case with the same intensity as that of Adolf Eichmann. The international judicial system revealed its limits. Every country demanded more evidence, more guarantees, more paperwork. But in the meantime, time worked in the fugitive's favor. Despite numerous leads, his trail always vanished before any real operation could take place. Political priorities shifted, and Mengele remained free. His case not only demonstrates a physical escape, but also a symbolic evasion. He never faced the testimonies, never heard the charges, and was never forced to justify his actions. And that void left an open historical wound, that of a crime without punishment, shielded by delay, bureaucracy, and negligence.